Hello, and welcome to episode number 123 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. Throughout the history of outlier moments that include reported paranormality and experiences of the UFO phenomenon, one of the most hotly contested questions has revolved around the underlying ontology of these experiences. Put succinctly, researchers have landed on different sides of the fence in terms of whether these events happen within quote-unquote physical reality or within some kind of imaginal realm that is neither imaginary nor exactly real, as in physical either. Of course, reductionistic materialists will claim that the distinction between the imaginal and the imaginary represents a distinction without a difference. That is to say, if it's not happening in physical reality, then it's simply not real. Full stop, at least according to them. Certain scholars from the humanities will cry foul here, saying that to dismiss these experiences as no different than dreams is to miss what they see as a parallel but different kind of realityscape. Even more thoughtful explorations have called into question each of these framings, suggesting that beyond the objective and subjective, there may exist something we might call the omnijective, a third category that transcends but includes both, positing reality is neither purely external, that is, objective, nor purely internal, subjective. This notion of reality refuses to accept that one could ever study reality as an out-there notion to begin with, because in being part and parcel of it, our very study of it changes it. Along these lines, Michael Talbot's classic, The Holographic Universe, contends that the universe itself is structured like a hologram, a unified whole in which every part contains the information of the whole. Reality as we perceive it is seen as a projection of deeper, non-local frequencies or patterns, much like a holographic image arises from interference patterns. This novel idea is particularly compelling because it integrates quantum physics, neuroscience, and mystical experience into a single framework of holistic reality. And it's this tantalizing integration that we'll seek to unpack in this, the 123rd episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. As we begin this week's episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support this podcast and the work I do in general, and in so doing gain access to all of my content, which includes the podcasts I release on a weekly basis, as well as the feature series I create, including ones on the Seth material, the Raw Contact material, the Dolores Cannon material, and upcoming soon, the books by Carlos Castaneda, as well as OTC Squared, and early access and discounts to online courses and in-person retreats, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. All right, with that preamble aside, let's move on to today's topic. In describing this week's episode, I said, upcoming on PoC, retracing the steps that led to the realization in both physics and neuroscience that reality functions like a hologram, and exploring the implications this holds for the paranormal, psi phenomena, and interdimensional interactions with NHI. This really is fascinating, and this is a thread we've been pursuing for a long time now on this podcast, whether you call it idealism in terms of a reality model or something like the holographic universe kind of model that Michael Talbot talks about. Now, of course, Michael Talbot was basing this book on the revelations and the research conducted by Carl Pribram, who is a neuroscientist, and David Bohm, who is a theoretical physicist. Both of these gentlemen came to very similar conclusions about the holographic nature of reality. This is fascinating, of course, because as we've been saying on podcast episodes for quite some time now, this fits remarkably well with a non-dual or transpersonal understanding of reality itself. And this is worth exploring because what Michael Talbot does in drawing from each of these gentlemen's work is build a very theoretical and practical bridge between what we might call the sciences and mysticism and mystical experience. In other words, a bridge between physics and metaphysics. All that's included here. And what's remarkable is that this is so well attested to. Again, these gentlemen were in completely different fields of inquiry, and they were stuck, realizing that the predominant physicalist or reductionistic materialist view of the world just wasn't going to fit with the data, couldn't make sense of some phenomena that we know are part and parcel of reality. For instance, when it comes to the brain, we understand that even after you remove large segments of the brain, people still remember things. They still have a sense of identity. This flies in the face of this physicalist notion that memories are actually contained in certain locations in the brain. This doesn't fit well at all. What we find actually is that the brain seems to work more holographically. Same thing with physics, that we don't really have this notion of particles per se. When you really get down to it, it's like a field of interaction where certain temporary excitations of that field spring up on what we tend to call particles. But Bohm's point is that's really a misnomer, because these are really just excitations of the underlying field. A field that's interactive, by the way, pointing to what Bohm saw as a participatory cosmos, where the way we think about it and interact with it changes how it manifests. This is true, of course, with the placebo effect. This goes to the nth degree according to Bohm, as well as according to Pribram. And what Talbot's doing is coming along after having been someone himself who experienced the paranormal and psi phenomena, etc. himself. He came along, drew from the work of these two different researchers from different fields, and lined this up with ancient non-dual traditions, and helped again demonstrate that this could be a bridge to science finally grappling with these notions that have been recognized in ancient wisdom traditions going back thousands of years in human history. Of course, another reason why I'm interested in this particular topic is because of my own experiences outside the construct, as I like to say, when upon returning, this doesn't seem real in the same way that it did before. Now, the research in this book gets to the heart of this. It helps explain why this may be the case, and why it's the case also for people who have near-death experiences and come back and feel like this somehow is only a substandard kind of reality, that there's something that's more substantive at a deeper level that is also somewhat paradoxically less dense. So more refined, more energetic, less dense, but ultimately more real. So this kind of turns upside down notions we have, where we tend to make the physical the true barometer for the real. At least in Western civilization, that's the case. All right, let's lay this out. Let's talk about the core thesis developed in The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. Number one, the universe itself is structured like a hologram, which is to say it's a unified whole in which every part contains the information of the whole. And as I said in the introduction, this notion integrates neuroscience, quantum physics, and mystical human experience into a single framework of holistic reality, a single framework that is describable, that is testable, I would argue. And this fundamentally means that reality as we perceive it is a projection of deeper non-local frequencies or patterns, much like a holographic image which arises from interference patterns. So fascinating notion. And again, what's really interesting is these two different researchers in completely different fields of study, one quantum physics, the other neuroscience, came to these same conclusions. And this points to the fact that this holographic nature of reality, or holographic-like nature of reality, is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. All right, so that said, let's talk about the scientific foundations behind these two gentlemen's discoveries. Let's start with David Bohm. Now, he was a theoretical physicist and a former protege of Einstein, actually. He developed the implicate order model, arguing that the universe is an unbroken, interconnected whole in which all points contain the information of the whole. He saw particles as projections of deeper, non-local processes, and his work provides the physics foundation for the holographic model Talbot builds upon. Now, again, what's fascinating is that for a long period of time in Western civilization anyway, people basically dismissed notions coming from ancient wisdom traditions. But as we developed greater technology and greater scientific awareness around how the substrate nature of reality was actually working, we found that it mirrored to a great degree these notions that had already been discussed in these ancient wisdom traditions going back thousands and thousands of years. Now, of course, the reason why that is the case, why these people from thousands of years ago could have tapped into something that we're only now in the 20th and 21st century uncovering via our scientific inquiry, is because the point is that we and everything else are the same thing, one gigantic thing, one gigantic interconnected whole. And so when we know something, we know it directly from our experience. This speaks to the notion that the illusion of separation is just that all these myriad forms and objects and beings and types of life are all mainly illusory, that underlyingly is all the movement of one thing, a movement that David Bohm liked to call a holomovement. Now, to understand reality as it unfolds, and I use that word very carefully here, very purposefully, David Bohm suggested there are two different kinds of reality in play here. The first, which he named the explicate order, is the world that we see, the world of forms, interactions, hard surfaces, that kind of thing. But he argued that this fundamentally arose from an implicate order, which in many ways is more real. It's the realm of no form, but from which the potential for all forms arise. So the enfolded part of reality is called the implicate order, and the unfolded is the explicate order. This also fits with people like Sri Aurobindo and notions in ancient wisdom traditions, again, that speak about not just evolution, movement back towards one, but also involution, the spilling out of the oneness into the many, many forms. So, just to make this crystal clear, the explicate order is the manifest world of separateness and form, what certain non-dual traditions might have described as Maya, which is to say illusion, and perhaps even more precisely, carefully crafted illusion, or Leela, the play of forms by spirit. That's the explicate order. Now, according to Bohm, the implicate order is an underlying enfolded realm where everything is interconnected and non-local. Physical reality unfolds from this deeper implicate level. So I want to now quote from the book where this is discussed. Quote, "Most mind-boggling of all are Bohm's fully developed ideas about wholeness. Because everything in the cosmos is made out of the seamless holographic fabric of the implicate order, he believes it is as meaningless to view the universe as composed of parts as it is to view the different geysers in a fountain as separate from the water out of which they flow. An electron is not an elementary particle, quote-unquote. It is just a name given to a certain aspect of the holomovement. Dividing reality up into parts and then naming those parts is always arbitrary, a product of convention, because subatomic particles and everything else in the universe are no more separate from one another than different patterns in an ornate carpet. This is a profound suggestion." In his general theory of relativity, Einstein astounded the world when he said that space and time are not separate entities, but are smoothly linked and part of a larger whole he called the space-time continuum. Bohm takes this idea a giant step further. He says that everything in the universe is part of a continuum. Despite the apparent separateness of things at the explicate level, everything is a seamless extension of everything else. And ultimately, even the implicate and explicate orders blend into each other. This again fits very well with non-dual notions, that even these two are not two in terms of the forms and the formless. Continuing with the quote here, "Take a moment to consider this. Look at your hand. Now look at the light streaming from the lamp beside you, and at the dog resting at your feet. You are not merely made of the same things, you are the same thing. One thing, unbroken. One enormous something that has extended its uncountable arms and appendages into all the apparent objects, atoms, restless oceans, and twinkling stars in the cosmos." Bohm cautions that this does not mean the universe is a giant undifferentiated mass. Things can be part of an undivided whole and still possess their own unique qualities. To illustrate what he means, he points to the little eddies and whirlpools that often form in a river. At a glance, such eddies appear to be separate things and possess many individual characteristics, such as size, rate, and direction of rotation, etc. But careful scrutiny reveals that it is impossible to determine where any given whirlpool ends and the river begins. Thus, Bohm is not suggesting that the differences between things is meaningless. He merely wants us to be aware constantly that dividing various aspects of the holomovement into things, quote-unquote, is always an abstraction, a way of making those aspects stand out in our perception by our way of thinking. In attempts to correct this, instead of calling different aspects of the holomovement things, he prefers to call them, quote-unquote, relatively independent subtotalities. And now in the final paragraph of this quote here, he gets into the implications, the consequences of our insistence that this abstraction is somehow real. Quoting again, "Indeed, Bohm believes that our almost universal tendency to fragment the world and ignore the dynamic interconnectedness of all things is responsible for many of our problems, not only in science, but in our lives and our society as well. For instance, we believe we can extract the valuable parts of the earth without affecting the whole. We believe it is possible to treat parts of our body and not be concerned with the whole. We believe we can deal with various problems in our society, such as crime, poverty, and drug addiction, without addressing the problems in our society as a whole, and so on." In his writings, Bohm argues passionately that our current way of fragmenting the world into parts not only doesn't work, but may even lead to our extinction, unquote. I very much agree with that kind of thinking, and this is exactly what motivated my Essence of Being platform, where I basically develop courses and retreats and whatnot, where we try to experience the world in a more integrated way, as a more holistic kind of movement, again, which is underlyingly what it really is, and what we truly are as well. Now, just to be crystal clear, all of what I just described was the research and the postulations of one particular man, David Bohm, who was working as a theoretical physicist, again, at one time was a protege of Einstein himself. Now, I mentioned there in that quote what we call the space-time continuum. Of course, anyone that grew up on Star Trek: The Next Generation has heard that term over and over again. It's kind of a mainstay now. We take it for granted. But we sometimes, in the midst of that, forget that when this was first proposed by Einstein, that space and time are actually one integrated fabric, not two different things, this was absolutely revolutionary and backwards to the way people have been thinking for a long time, at least again within Western civilization and foundations of physics. But Bohm went much further than Einstein. He suggested that everything is actually one thing, one entangled whole. And of course, that term hints at this, entanglement. This is exactly what quantum physics described. It's what Einstein actually wrestled with himself. He had a hard time believing that when you didn't look at the moon, it wasn't really there. From Bohm's point of view, this makes complete sense because it's our interaction with the field, we ourselves being part of the holographic nature of all that is. It's that interaction, that dynamic interaction, which causes the manifestation, which leads to our perception, which is very different than the way things truly are. In fact, he would go so far as to say that it does no good to think about things in that kind of way because it's this dynamic relationship between the implicate and the explicate order that allows things to arise as they do and also return back to this kind of formless realm. And again, I just want to point out this fits remarkably well with non-dual thinking and the experiential revelations, the gnosis coming out of these ancient wisdom traditions time and time again. So that was all David Bohm. Pretty amazing stuff. Now, isn't it even more amazing that someone else in a completely different academic field, this time neuroscience, came to very similar conclusions when he was trying to solve some enduring problems in neuroscience? Here I speak of Karl Pribram. This book discusses the work of both of these men and the implications of the intersection of their research. Now, Pribram was a neuroscientist known for pioneering research on memory and brain function. He proposed the holonomic brain model, asserting that the brain encodes and retrieves information using hologram-like interference patterns. He showed that memory is distributed and not stored in localized files. This speaks to what I said a bit earlier. His work provides the neuroscience foundation for Talbot's holographic interpretation of mind and perception. All right, let's unpack Pribram's holographic brain theory. Again, he suggested that the brain encodes and decodes information holographically. Memory and perception are distributed across the brain rather than localized, and this mirrors holographic storage principles. And he would go further and say that consciousness and perception themselves may be thought of as holographic processes. Now, I want to jump back into the book to describe Pribram and his research. Quote, Pribram realized that if the holographic brain model was taken to its logical conclusions, it opened the door on the possibility that objective reality, the world of coffee cups, mountain vistas, elm trees, and table lamps, might not even exist, or at least not exist in the way we believe it exists. Now, as an aside, think about what I've been saying about this is not real the way we think it is. That's an experiential kind of gnosis. Going back to the quote now, was it possible, he wondered, that what the mystics have been saying for centuries was true? Reality was Maya, an illusion, and what was out there was really a vast resonating symphony of waveforms, a frequency domain that was transformed into the world as we know it only after it entered our senses, unquote. Truly fascinating. And again, this describes a bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. Now, like we did with David Bohm, let's break down the specifics of Carl Pribram's kind of model. He said that reality is constructed. In that sense, what we experience as the external world is really a mental projection, a translation of interference patterns by the brain, which is to say what's really out there is not physical or temporal at all, in the sense that when you look at holographic film, it looks nothing like the three-dimensional objects that are projected once you shine a light through that kind of film. Pribram also talked about the centrality of non-locality, that all points in space and time are fundamentally connected. Information can be instantaneously shared across vast distances because ultimately those distances aren't real. He saw consciousness as primary, something we've been saying on this podcast for years now. In his perspective, the mind is not confined to the brain, but is rather part of a larger universal consciousness field. And from this perspective, reality as we experience it is malleable. That means that phenomena such as the paranormal or psychical phenomena, including telepathy, psychokinesis, and synchronicity, may be natural outcomes of a holographic consciousness-based reality. In other words, this doesn't look so strange once you see it from this perspective. And it's usually that kind of shift in understanding that really points to when we are uncovering something truly real, something much closer to base reality itself. So what are the implications for the paranormal and mystical phenomena? Because this is something we've been uncovering and looking into on this podcast for years now, almost 5 years, from this perspective of a consciousness as primary kind of model and leaning on this holographic notion of how reality is constructed using this interaction between an implicate and explicate order, we can understand how some of these outlier phenomena might arise. Let's first think about psychic experiences. So telepathy, precognition, and healing phenomena are explained as accessing the deeper implicate order. So while we see and experience the explicate order in our daily waking state, if you will, we also have access to the implicate order. That's what gnosis basically is, and that can also explain why psychic experiences occur. Then let's think about synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences, as Jung talked about, arise when patterns from the implicate order are unfolding into the explicate world. What about altered states of consciousness? Well, mystical or near-death experiences reveal the holographic nature of reality where time and space dissolve. Again, this is described over and over again in NDEs, in OBEs, often even in some kinds of contact experiences. Mystical experience in human history is rife with this kind of notion that space and time aren't even really real in those kinds of realityscapes. What about what we might call miraculous phenomena? Well, Talbot discusses poltergeists, stigmata, and psychokinetic effects as extensions of consciousness interacting with the implicate order. Again, we may be experiencing in our daily waking state the explicate, but we have access to the implicate at any time. And this can produce basically miraculous phenomena, and this is actually no less natural, quote unquote, than anything else we usually experience that is already arising as part of the explicate order. So if all of this is true, one might ask, what are the implications if we take this seriously, if we begin to apply and lean into this kind of understanding of reality? Well, the implications for human potential and healing are immense. Let's first think about mind-body unity. Health and illness arise from patterns within the holographic field of consciousness, not from what looks like arisings in the explicate order. Big difference there, which isn't to say you can't interact with and intervene at the explicate level, but what would be even more dramatic and more consequential is when you can tap into the implicate itself with intention alone. Again, something described in some of our ancient wisdom traditions. What about visualization and belief? Well, the mind's imagery can alter bodily and physical conditions because both are expressions of the same underlying field. Again, this notion of the omnijective rather than the objective versus the subjective. And again, with the placebo effect, we see this happening already. I would argue that the implications and the data are already out there. We just are not ready yet as a collective to wrestle with the implications. So ultimately, what we might describe is reality functioning like a mirror, in the sense that external circumstances often mirror inner psychological and energetic states. Of course, this very much comports with what Carl Jung described when he suggested that the physical world is the flip side of the coin of the collective unconscious. So we have both the notion of the individual unconscious, but also the collective unconscious. And what we might describe as consensus reality is actually a byproduct of the way we collectively think about reality and our interaction with it. All right, what are the philosophical implications? We talked about some of the pragmatic implications in terms of health and well-being. What about the deeper philosophical implications? Well, according to this understanding, the universe is a cosmic unity, meaning matter, energy, and consciousness are not separate, never have been, but are rather expressions of a single holographic whole. In this sense, dualism dissolves, hence non-duality that goes back thousands of years. And this means that subject and object, inner and outer, are two aspects of the same reality field. So really, we are talking here about creation as a kind of art form. The universe is an ongoing process, or we might say dance in non-dual circles, between enfoldment and unfoldment, akin to a living artwork or thought form. What about spiritual resonance? Well, many mystical and esoteric traditions, as we've been saying, including Vedanta, Buddhism, and Hermeticism, have long hinted at this holographic truth. They might not have had the technology, the understanding of the way this works with the precision we can point to now because they didn't have holographic film and lasers and things like that, but they understood the basic principles. And now we have the specific data, the evidence to point to the fact that this is indeed what we've intuited has been the case for thousands of years. So what is the overall message here? Well, as I've been saying, the holographic universe model offers a bridge between science and mysticism, meaning we might finally have an ability to bring those two back together after their rather hasty divorce several centuries ago. We also think about the fact that boundaries between self and cosmos, mind and matter, are fundamentally illusory. They may look that way, we may be able to experience them that way. In fact, I would argue we do because it's meaningful, it's purposeful, but it's just not the way things really are. And when you've had experiences like I've had, some of you have had, people who've had NDEs have had, contact experiences, etc., you just know it. And once you know it, you can't unknow it. So this understanding of reality holographically could transform science, healing, and human self-conception, showing consciousness as the organizing principle of everything, And when we fundamentally are consciousness, what does that open up in terms of possibilities? One fascinating aspect I want to point to here is how, because we can have a role in the very authoring of reality, we are co-authors, as these ancient traditions have been saying for thousands of years. This has major implications for how people in the future may indeed perceive reality. Now, you might object and say, well, there's reality and there's our conception of it. Again, that distinction is largely meaningless. Because we are co-authors, we can change the field itself. And at the very least, our interventions, our ways of interacting with and describing reality can have legacies that last for perhaps thousands of years, even longer. And I want to read from a quote in the book now that points to this very, very interesting kind of notion. Quote, "There is evidence that the structures clairvoyants inadvertently create in the energy field can be remarkably long-lived. For centuries, the ancient Hindus believed that each chakra also had a Sanskrit letter written in its center. Japanese researcher Hiroshi Motoyama, a clinical psychologist who has successfully developed a technique for measuring the electrical presence of the chakras, says that he first became interested in the chakras because his mother, a simple woman with natural clairvoyant gifts, could see them clearly. However, for years she was puzzled because she could see what looked like an inverted sailboat in her heart chakra. It wasn't until Motoyama began his investigations that he discovered what his mother was seeing was the Sanskrit letter Yam, the letter the ancient Hindus perceived in the heart chakra. Some psychics, such as Dreyer, say that they also see Sanskrit letters in the chakras. Others do not. The only explanation appears to be that psychics who see the letters are actually tuning into holographic structures long ago imposed on the energy field by the beliefs of the ancient Hindus. At first glance, this notion may seem strange, but it does have a precedent. As we have seen, one of the basic tenets of quantum physics is that we are not discovering reality, but participating in its creation. It may be that as we probe deeper into the levels of reality beyond the atom, the levels where the subtle energies of the human aura appear to lie, the participatory nature of reality becomes even more pronounced. Thus, we must be extremely cautious about saying that we have discovered a particular structure or pattern in the human energy field when we may have actually created what we have found." Unquote. Truly fascinating, but it's absolutely a consequence that makes sense, because if it's true that this is a participatory cosmos and that we ourselves are part of the unfolded hologram, then we can have an impact on the hologram. It's an interactive dynamic model. I think back to the first generation of websites on the World Wide Web, where basically they were just readable. You couldn't write to them. Sending an email was about as dynamic as it got. Of course, today's apps and websites are very, very different. They're incredibly interactive and participatory, and there are entire worlds that have now been created that people play as part of these games, where the unfolding of the world is, of course, the byproduct of all the actions of all the players involved in it. Very much a participatory cosmos, and that is actually just a subset of the very nature of reality itself that we find ourselves within. So the very act of looking changes what you find, even might determine what you find, might itself create structures that have semi-permanence that might impact how people in the future understand the structure of reality. These are incredibly consequential revelations of the highest order and really points to what, again, these ancient non-dual traditions have been saying for centuries, millennia even, that we are indeed co-authors, co-creators, that we are fundamentally what is described as Atman, and at the deepest non-dual understanding, Atman is no different than Brahman. And just to refresh everyone's memory, in this notion, Atman is the eternal pure consciousness that is your true self. And in Advaita Vedanta and broader Hindu philosophy, Brahman is defined as the non-dual infinite reality that is the source, substance, and essence of everything, and which is identical, again, with the deepest self. Therefore, Atman equals Brahman. So truly fascinating, the parallels here with ancient history and wisdom traditions that have basically permeated all of human history. Now, in addition to helping us bridge the physical and the metaphysical, this also opens up some very interesting avenues in terms of our understanding of the paranormal or of the UFO phenomenon or of interactions with apparitions, apparent ghosts, and things like that. Because one of the interesting things is how people try to make sense of these encounters. They seem, quote unquote, unnatural when someone sees a ghost. So people come up with all sorts of stories why the ghost might be there. Are they supposed to help the ghost, etc.? Well, perhaps this is just an implication of the fact that the holographic reality includes the past, present, and future. It's all enfolded within it. And that means that sometimes when we tap into the implicate, we can unfold things from the past or the future relative to us. And on that note, I want to quote from the book again, from the section called Phantasms from the Past. Quote, "The idea that the past is holographically recorded in the cosmic airwaves and can occasionally be plucked out by the human mind and converted into holograms may also explain at least some hauntings. Many ghostly apparitions appear to be little more than holograms, three-dimensional recordings of some person or scene from the past. For example, one theory about ghosts is that they are the soul or spirit of the deceased individual, but not all ghosts are human. There are numerous cases on record of individuals seeing phantoms of inanimate objects as well, a fact that belies the idea that apparitions are disincarnate souls. Phantasms of the Living, a massive 2-volume set of well-documented reports of hauntings and other paranormal phenomena compiled by the Society for Psychical Research in London, offers many such examples. For instance, in one case, a British military officer and his family watched as a spectral horse-drawn carriage pulled upon their lawn and stopped. So real was the ghostly carriage that the officer's son walked up to it and saw what appeared to be a female figure inside. The image vanished before he could obtain a better look and left no horse or wheel tracks. How common are such experiences? We do not know. But we do know that in the United States and England, several studies have shown that from 10 to 17% of the general population have seen an apparition, indicating that such phenomena may be far more common than most of us suspect. The notion that some events leave stronger imprints in the holographic record than others is also supported by the tendency of hauntings to occur at locations where some terrible act of violence or other unusually powerful emotional occurrence has taken place. The literature is filled with apparitions appearing at the sites of murders, military battles, and other kinds of mayhem. This suggests that in addition to images and sounds, the emotions being felt during an event are also recorded in the cosmic hologram. Again, it appears that it is the emotional intensity of such events that makes them more prominent in the holographic record and that allows normal individuals to unwittingly tap into them. And again, many of these hauntings appear to be less the product of unhappy earthbound spirits and more just accidental glimpses into the holographic record of the past, unquote. Absolutely, that's my perspective as well. These are not unnatural events. They're actually implications of the fact that everything is wound together and that everything is kept. Nothing is lost. Any event of history is kept in what we might call the Akashic records, for instance, just different language to describe the same kind of notion. So when people worry about losing some aspect of the past and never be able to revisit it, I just don't think that's true. I think that everything that has ever existed across the full cosmos and any experience felt by any sentient being at any time, anywhere, will always be available. This is the nature of the interactive mapping of the whole. I also want to point out that what was discussed there in terms of particularly intense emotions comports with what I've discussed before, where particularly emotionally impacting events are like large boulders dropped into a pond, and you think about the pond sending out these concentric circles, and think about one of those directions being what we perceive as the past relative to the future. So a particularly emotionally impacting event will send out larger concentric circles further into the past, if you will, which explains why people pick up things like 9/11 before it happens. And even though it's not often a conscious understanding, their body registers the trauma of it because they can pick it up in this deep knowing as part of this holographic record. All right, so a few minutes ago, we talked about apparitions, ghosts, and how that might just be an implication of this holographic nature of reality, where time itself is encoded within the hologram. How might this also apply to a notion like UFOs and NHI? What about these other beings that seem to be coming from other dimensions, as it were? Well, the book has something to say about this as well. And I quote, "If UFOs and related phenomena are merely psychic projections, how are we to explain the physical traces they leave behind, the burnt circles and deep impressions found at the sites of landings, the unmistakable tracks they make on radar screens, and the scars and incision marks they leave on the people on whom they perform their medical examinations?" In an article published in 1976, I proposed that such phenomena are difficult to categorize because we are trying to hammer them into a picture of reality that is fundamentally incorrect. Given that quantum physics has shown us that mind and matter are inextricably linked, I suggest that UFOs and related phenomena are further evidence of this ultimate lack of division between the psychological and the physical worlds. They are indeed a product of the collective human psyche, but they are also quite real. Put another way, they are something the human race has not yet learned to comprehend properly, a phenomenon that is neither subjective nor objective, but omnijective, a term I coined to refer to this unusual state of existence. I was unaware at the time that Corbin had already coined the term imaginal to describe the same blurred state of reality, only in the context of mystical experiences of the Sufis. This point of view has become increasingly prevalent among researchers. In a recent article, Ring, and here he's referencing Kenneth Ring, who researched NDEs and contact experiences with NHI, for instance. In a recent article, Ring argues that UFO encounters are imaginal experiences and are similar not only to the confrontations with the real, but mind-created world individuals experience during NDEs, but also to the mythic realities shamans encounter during journeys through the subtler dimensions. They are, in short, further evidence that reality is a multi-layered and mind-generated hologram. I find that I'm drawn more and more to points of view that allow me not only to acknowledge and honor the reality of these different experiences, but also to see the connections between realms that, for the most part, have been studied by different categories of scholars, states Ring. Shamanism, he continues, tends to be thrown into anthropology. UFOs tend to be thrown into whatever ufology is. NDEs are studied by parapsychologists and medical people. And Stan Grof studies psychedelic experiences from a transpersonal psychology perspective. I think there's a good reason to hope that the imaginal can be, and the holographic might still prove to be, perspectives that can allow one to see not the identities, but the linkages and commonalities between these different types of experiences." Unquote. So here again, we hear about this notion of the omnijective. So let's just define this specifically. So the objective assumes a world out there that exists independently of observers. Consciousness in this perspective perceives but does not fundamentally participate in creating reality. Then there's the notion of the subjective. This assumes reality is primarily constructed by the mind, and external events are secondary or derivative of inner states. Talbot's omnijective perspective points to a third category that transcends but includes both. This is very much fitting with my Wilberian kind of background. Reality is neither purely external, that is objective, nor purely internal or subjective. Observer and observed are holographically entangled. There's that term again, entanglement, each containing and influencing the other. Events arise from a both and interaction between mind and the implicate order, not from mind alone, nor from an independent external world. The brain, therefore, filters a holographic frequency domain, we might call it, into a stable space-time image. But minds also participate in shaping what emerges from that holographic substrate. And because the hologram encodes the whole in every part, every observer participates in the formation of every event. That's a remarkable implication, is it not? While every event simultaneously constrains every observer. So in short, objective means it's out there. Subjective means it's in here. Omnijective means there is no in here versus out there. Both arise from the same holographic source and mutually specify one another. All right, so what can we say of this intersection between the research of Karl Pribram and David Bohm? Well, considered together, Bohm and Pribram's theories provide a profound new way of looking at the world. Our brains mathematically construct objective reality by interpreting frequencies that are ultimately projections from another dimension, a deeper order of existence that is beyond both space and time. The brain itself is a hologram enfolded in a holographic universe. That's what the work of people like Pribram and Bohm are pointing to. And as I've been saying throughout this episode, this has major parallels with transpersonal and non-dual traditions. Let's explore that in closing here. From the holographic universe view, if reality is holographic and multidimensional, then other domains of consciousness can coexist within the same informational field, interpenetrating ours without being spatially elsewhere. This is key. We often hear about these beings that seem to interpenetrate our own reality, that different kinds of reality are impacted, for instance, with the detonating of atomic bombs. This might point to realities that not only interpenetrate, but influence and impact each other. What about encounters with non-human entities, including ETs, spirit beings, and archetypal forms? These may represent phase shifts in consciousness itself, tuning into other frequencies within the holographic spectrum. So in this sense, they're both real and an aspect of the unfolding of the hologram. These beings could be self-organizing information structures, pattern complexes in the deeper implicate order, expressing themselves within human perceptual bandwidth, and perhaps at a specific point in time as part of this unfolding. In that sense, it might be conscious and purposeful as well. And again, both things are true at the same time, meaning this is both the self-organizing information structure that arises in the form of these various beings, and we in turn might arise in their awareness for similar reasons. Now, how would we look at this from a transpersonal perspective? Well, such intelligences can be seen as autonomous aspects of the collective psyche, something I've been discussing a lot recently, or transpersonal fields of consciousness that intersect human awareness. Again, all part of the same oneness, but interactive in nature. They may serve initiatory or evolutionary roles, reflections of humanity's own deeper intelligence mirrored back through other dimensional imagery. Contact experiences, therefore, can be understood as dialogues within the larger field of mind, capital M, where human and non-human are contextual distinctions, not fundamentally ontologically separate. A key distinction there. It's both real experientially, but not ultimately real because everything's arising from the oneness. A non-dual perspective would say that there are no others, quote unquote, whether we mean human, alien, or spirit. All appearances, whether luminous or mundane, are expressions of the same consciousness field. Interdimensional intelligences, then, that we hear talked about in Congress recently, are really movements within awareness, valid at the level of experience again, but not ultimately separate or independently existing entities. True contact, therefore, is not between beings, but between awareness and its own projection, recognizing itself in novel form. So let's think about some integrative implications of this understanding, where all of these different traditions, both recent in terms of this notion of scientific inquiry coming from the holographic model, and ancient non-dual traditions and transpersonal psychology, etc., how can we arrive at some sort of integrative awareness here? It allows psi, survival after death phenomena, and interdimensional phenomena to be normalized within a unified ontology of consciousness, rather than dismissed as anomalies and therefore unreal. Yet from a non-dual standpoint, the model itself is part of the hologram, useful for pointing beyond itself but not the final word. Like what I've discussed in some of my classes, we use certain stones to cross the pond, and when we've done that, we turn around and the stones are gone. This is the emergent nature of reality in a participatory cosmos. Therefore, the deepest realization is that there is no inside or outside, no dimensions or orders ultimately, only the ever-present field of awareness appearing as infinite variations of itself. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.